We are on to our last discussion board for this course, and so we're going to be finishing up the last two sections in your methods. And so we covered the first part of your methods last week, and this week we'll be covering the second half that you will again write drafts for in discussion board 3. And so in this Edpuzzle, we're going to briefly go over just some housekeeping, then the lecture content about writing the drafts for these two remaining sections, being your procedure and analysis. Briefly go over the instructions for discussion board 3, which is very straightforward. So as far as housekeeping, you should have already received feedback from me on your first discussion board, which you then use to revise that research proposal idea in discussion board 2. Your feedback for your discussion board 2 post, in which you had your revised research idea in addition to your participants and your materials, you should have by tomorrow. In this discussion board this week, you are not required to provide a revised version of your drafts from last week. But of course, look at the feedback and let me know if you have any questions, and also look at the feedback about how you're completing the discussion board itself to make sure that you're getting full credit for things like your responses to peers. Should also have grades on both of those by tomorrow. So as we're moving forward, kind of piecemealing this together with drafts of individual sections within the discussion boards, I made a recommendation last week to get this all organized into a working document within Microsoft Word so that you can keep track of everything. I encourage you to keep doing that. Write these two new sections within that draft, like hopefully you did last week, and then paste them into the discussion board. Just keeping in mind the kind of end product that we'll get to next week, which is to put all of this together. All of these sections will go at the end of your literature review, and then everything will get formatted into a research proposal, and that's going to be the assignment for next week. So moving on to the second part of the methods. Last week we conquered the participants and the materials. And so when you look through empirical papers or any other people's research proposals, the individual sections within the method are not always exactly the same, and sometimes they're called different things. But in general, we're conquering the 4 major categories, and so we have 2 left, one of which is the procedure, which you will see in every single method section, and it's an important part. And so the procedure is pretty easy to write, so it's somewhat like a story. But really, the procedure is the instructions for completing the study. And it's a story because it has a beginning, so you're going to start with the first thing that you would do to conduct this study, which would be recruiting and finding your participants. Then you'll explain everything in the middle, and then eventually at the end, this procedure story will end with how you debrief participants and compensate them if you decided in your methods to compensate them. Just like all the other ones, it's written in future tense. And so really what we're answering in this section is, what will you do as the researcher? What will the researchers be doing? And what will the participants be doing? The second section you're going to tackle for this week is the analysis section. And this is a more boilerplate section. It's a little shorter. They're generally about a paragraph long, so not really difficult to write. And about half of it is going to be the same across everyone. And so we'll look more at that at the latter part of this Edpuzzle. But some of the main things that you're going to answer in that is, how are you going to handle data to ensure confidentiality, which is a really important thing to maintain an ethical research study. No one's going to approve you for something that's unethical, and one of the main components of ethics is keeping all of your participants' information confidential and safe so that no one else could possibly access it. The second thing that we answer in the analysis section is, how are you going to use the data? What are you going to do with it to answer your research question? And so I basically am going to give you some boilerplate sentences that you can use for the statistical analysis that you're going to do. And then you'll briefly write about your expected results, which is essentially restating your hypotheses that you had in your research proposal idea from last week. So let's dive deeper into the procedure. So I set the analogy of the method section being like a recipe last week, and I want you to continue to keep that in mind. So last week we put the ingredients. We decided on our ingredients. We have the participants and the materials. We have all of the materials and the people. And now what are you going to do with it? So the procedure is the instructions and the steps to making a dish. And so just like if you were to read instructions for a recipe, it goes in order, what should be done first, then what happens, what you use while you're doing that, and all of that. But I don't want you to directly relate it too much to a recipe and give me a numbered, bulleted list of things to do. This procedure is still going to be written in paragraph form, and it will be in future tense. And we'll look at a lot of examples. But now let's get into what specific things you need to make sure that you include in this procedure section. So at the end, it's going to end up being a story of what words occur, who's doing all of these actions, what order are these actions occurring in to do all of these things that are necessary to conduct your study. It should be specific enough. Again, we want the idea is that someone else needs to be able to replicate what you're doing using these instructions. So these are really specific, so someone could go and do exactly what you did to the T, including the type of pencil that they used, how long they sat at the computer. Okay, so the more specific you are, the better. And a lot of this stuff you can just make up on your own, and the others, if there's something that you more specific, like a measure, again, we're just going to go into our previous articles, and you can get a lot of information from their procedure sections as well. Now, the story that you end up with, it's going to have characters. Again, you're explaining what the researchers do and what the participants do. And it's going to have a timeline so that you're not describing things in random order. If you described a recipe in a random order, no one would ever know how to cook it and get the same result, right? So it needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Just like all the other materials section, it's written in future tense. And so here is the specific content that we need to make sure that you have in there. So you're going to, first thing that you would start with by doing a study and that you need to explain in your procedure section is how you, as the researchers, will recruit participants. Where are you going to go to find them? How are you going to invite them to participate? Are you giving them a flyer? Are you asking them in person? Are you, so that's the first step to start your study. How are you going to get your participants, and what are you going to do to recruit them? That's the beginning of the story. The second thing that every study must have that also helps ensure an ethical study is how are you going to get informed consent for participants? And so before participants join your study, we have to give them informed consent, which essentially is a written out form that explains the study to them. It explains their rights, that they can join the study. They're able to drop out of the study whenever they feel like it. It explains things like some risks that they might incur through the study, how much time the study is going to take them. So essentially you tell them everything out front, and then you give them the opportunity to participate or not participate. Basically, for your procedure section, you just have to explain how you're going to get informed consent from people. Informed consent, are they going to read it on a computer and then decide if they want to participate? Are you going to give them a form in person by hand that they then hand back to you? So those are the first two things that every study will start with. Then what follows is the actual procedure that you and the participants will do, and that will be more variable across all of the studies depending on what you're measuring and what your participants are doing. And so you need to describe, again, in order, everything that researchers will do, how they do it, where are they going to do it? Are you going to be in a school? Are you going to be in a lab? Are you going to be on a computer? And using what? So are you going to give them a certain questionnaire or a certain tool? And so all of these materials that you described in your materials section should then, of course, be incorporated into your procedure. Again, just like a recipe, you gave them all the ingredients, and now you have to tell people how to use the ingredients. And so you'll need to, if you have a certain questionnaire, you'll have to explain when and how that will be given. So everything the researchers will do, and then everything the participants will do. Again, how they'll do it, where they'll do it, and using what. So things within this kind of broader section where you're explaining the procedure for your specific study, if you have different groups, they're probably doing different things, which is the whole sometimes they're doing different things. And so if they are doing different things, we need to explain that. And also we need to explain approximately how long all of this will take. It's important for ethical reasons to know how much time you're going to take for your participants. And so how long do we think each questionnaire is going to take? How long are the therapy sessions going to take? How long, any type of task that they're doing, you want to just give an estimate. If you have to guess because you've never seen this questionnaire, that's fine. You can just make a guess and act as if you know exactly how long it takes, okay? So we have these two pieces in the beginning that go in everyone's, how you're going to recruit them, how you're going to get informed consent. In the middle of the procedure section is going to really vary across everyone, just depending on what your experiment or your study is doing. And then the end, again, is all similar, more similar across people. So the end of the procedure section is always going to finish with how researchers, how you, the researchers, going to debrief participants and give them their compensation if you decided to give them any. And so debriefing is essentially what you do when you explain the whole study to participants after the fact. And so sometimes we keep some things from participants and informed consent before they do it. We keep some of the details from them because we don't want to spoil or taint the data collection. We don't want to tell them what their treatment's supposed to do. It might influence how they react to the treatment. And so we don't tell them all the nitty-gritty details up front because we don't really want their knowledge to affect the results of the study, right? But after they're done, we can tell them everything. And so that is the debriefing. And essentially all you have to do is describe that you're going to debrief them. And just like informed consent, you could, you know, they could read it online, you could tell them in person, you could give them a flyer that explains the study, however. And then explain the compensation. And if you decided to compensate people, that's totally something you can come up with on your own and just be creative but practical. So let's look at some examples and break them down. Again, if you don't know where to start, look at the procedures for the studies that you reviewed in your literature review that are similar to your study. It's actually ideal to have your procedure be similar to the procedures of the studies that came before you. That makes it so that we can compare the results. You can't compare our results to the results of another study if you guys did completely different things, right? And so you can really get a lot of information and ideas and reference just by going and looking at the actual procedure sections for your study, for the previous studies in your literature review, rather. Just keeping in mind that what's going to be different is that you're writing about the procedure you want to do, so it'll be in future tense, and they're writing about a procedure that already happened. And so really it's just the tense of the writing, future versus past tense. That's the difference there. So let's go ahead and look at some examples. This is a procedure section from one of the papers that we've been looking at examples of in the other two Edpuzzles. And so we see that the beginning of this procedure section starts with how researchers are going to recruit participants. And so it reads, researchers will post recruitment at the Marcus Autism Center in Atlanta. And so we're saying who's doing what and where. The researchers will post the recruitment text here as well as various autism spectrum disorder Facebook support pages. Flyers and Facebook posts will read as follows. This is a recruitment text afterwards that they just made up with, but you can come up with your own. So it reads, we are in search of mothers with a child between the ages of 3 and 6 who have been diagnosed with ASD. If you would like to participate in a study on stress in ASD parents, please click on the link below. So we're saying researchers are giving them this at these places, and it's going to say this. Now the next part that's in this procedure section is, again, consent. So these are the two parts that have to go in everyone's procedure section at the beginning, because they're the first two things that any study must do. So this consent, it says participants are going to electronically sign a form of consent. And so these people are finding the recruitment text on Facebook. They're clicking on the link, and then it shows them with consent. So they're going to electronically sign a consent form, and then the computer is going to direct them to a demographic survey followed by the stress questionnaire. If at any time the participants opt out of the study, they will be redirected to a thank you page with contact information. So that's something that they added in. You don't necessarily have to have that in there, okay? Again, you can kind of get creative with this, or just try to think as you go along. It just needs to meet some of the primary requirements and be practical. It has to do something that you actually could do, and it has to be ethical as well. The next part is how participants actually participate. And so this is a simple online survey. So this has a very short description of what participants are going to do. So the computer is going to route participants to the demographic survey, which will take 10 to 15 minutes. Again, we have to say how long everything takes. And then the computer will route them to the stress questionnaire, which will take 45 to 60 minutes to complete. Okay, now again, they just made up these numbers. They're practical numbers. You know, I could see a demographic questionnaire being 10 minutes and a longer questionnaire being 60, okay? But again, it's saying how long, it's saying who's going to do it, the computer is going to route participants, etc. The last part here is how participants will be debriefed and compensated. So after completing all of the measures, participants will be directed to a thank you page, assumingly by the computer, where they will be debriefed with a description of the purpose of the study. The computer will inform them that the email address they provided will be added to a raffle, and that the winner of the raffle will be announced by email within the next 2 months. So we describe how we're going to debrief them. The computer is going to show them and explain it, and then how we're going to compensate them within the next 2 months. We'll randomly pick someone using their email address. So we have all four parts there, rather. This is a similar example because it is another online survey study. And so we see similar ideas of recruiting the participants online. The computer is doing a lot by taking them to the survey. And I also think they have a lottery as compensation. But just looking here is the recruitment section. So you'll see this is longer than the one before. Some of them may only be 2 sentences long. So it really just depends on you. But again, it says where it occurs, what the recruitment text says. Again, they just came up with that, but really it's just a description of what their participants are. They say, we are looking for these people. If you're one of these people, please come participate in this study. They added this information in at the end here, which is not required, but again, add whatever you'd like. More specific is always better than less specific here. Remember, it needs to be a very detailed recipe that someone could do exactly like you after the fact. So there's the recruitment. Here's the informed consent. And so here, informed consent is going to occur on the computer again. So after clicking on the link and agreeing to, they're just going to be routed to that informed consent. Here is the participation. Again, this is a very short description of the participation because it is essentially just the participants who are already on the computer completing a questionnaire. And we gave an estimate that I'm assuming just came up with of 45 minutes. And you'll see the CSA survey here. Now, remember, again, that's one of the things that they have in their methods. And so it's important that everything that's in your methods is explained in this procedure section so that we know how to use those ingredients, right? The end here has debriefing and compensation. So let's look at perhaps some examples where the procedure for what participants do is not so simple. It's not just an online survey. Those are both online surveys, so all of them, which were described in the materials section. So essentially all you had to say was that participants are going to get there and do it, and it's going to take 45 minutes. But a lot of studies say that have multiple time points, like a pre-post, have multiple tasks or multiple measures, give the participants a treatment, have multiple groups that may be doing different things. These are all going to have much longer descriptions. And so that doesn't necessarily make those procedure sections harder. They're just going to be longer. But again, these procedure sections aren't really hard to write. They're just stories, and you're just going to try to come up with something practical. So for instance, this is just the middle section in someone else's procedure. So I didn't include the informed consent and recruitment, and I didn't include the stuff at the end about debriefing and compensation. This is just what their participants will be doing. This is just the middle section of their procedure. But in this study, the participants were doing equine therapy sessions, and they were doing multiple sessions. They were doing 24 sessions, in fact. And so here it's a much longer explanation because you have to explain everything that's going to happen across time, all of the materials that you're going to be using. And so we see they have 1-hour sessions for 24 weeks after an initial 2-hour orientation. They say what they'll do in the orientation section and how long it will take. They say what they'll do next, and so you can see that there's kind of a sequence in order of events of how these are happening. We also see that all of the things that were in the material section for this one is included in this description. So they're talking about all the equipment, the path instructor. And so we just see it as much, much longer, right? And so how long this part of your thing is just totally depends on your experiment. But you need to describe it so that people could do the exact same thing. Here's another example. Again, this is clipping out the recruitment informed consent, and then the end part being the debriefing and the compensation. And it's just looking at the description in the middle of what participants would do. And so in this example, there are 2 different groups of participants. There's a treatment, okay, we're making a comparison. So one group of participants is going to do social skills training, and the other one is just a control group for comparison, okay? And so here you see we have to explain what both groups do. So researchers will randomly assign participants to a social skills training group or a control group. Following that random assignment, participants will complete 10 1-hour sessions, 5 days a week for 2 weeks of whatever training they were assigned. Then we discuss what participants in the social skills training group will be doing. And then we discuss what the participants in the control group will be doing. So we're explaining the procedure for both of those different groups. Then we say what happens afterwards for both. They're going to, after each session, they're going to do some written reflections using the quality index questionnaire. So again, we're incorporating the things in the material into our description of the procedure, talking about how long it's taking here. And then they're actually coming back 3 months afterwards to do another post-assessment. So we have multiple time periods here and multiple groups. I just want you to take note of how we're explaining what's happening across time, what's happening at each time point, and what's happening within each group. So just some general notes. Again, the more detail is better. It's much easier for you to provide too much detail and us just say, well, that's really detailed, that looks great, than for you to not provide enough detail and for me to have to go back and ask you to elaborate more, okay? It's just more work. So go ahead, and just write your procedure in as much detail as possible. Try to take the perspective of someone else that's not in your head and say, would someone else be able to read this and do this exact same thing that I'm thinking of? And then again, of course, it all needs to be in future tense. I will, or the researcher will, or participants will, etc. Now let's talk about the analysis section. So this is essentially just going to pick up right where the procedure section left off. And so participants are done. You've got all this data from participants and you've sent them on their way. They've been compensated maybe and debriefed. And now you've got all of their information. So now what? How are you going to use it? So let's look at some specifics content-wise that need to be in this section. So essentially, this section is going to explain three things. How are you going to handle the data? So is all the data already in a computer? What are you going to do with it? Is your data on these paper questionnaires? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to make sure that data that you've got stays confidential so that your participants' information isn't accessible to anyone else? The next thing you have to address in this section is how will you analyze this data? And so we've got to run some statistics to essentially come out with some results so that we can answer our research questions with those results, right? Now, I know that you probably don't remember much from your statistics course or aren't really comfortable, choosing the statistical analysis that needs to happen. That's fine. I'm going to give you one of three to choose from based on your research design that you came up with last week. So I've kind of done that part for you. Then the very end of this is what are your anticipated results? And so again, essentially your hypotheses, again, from your research idea. So how will you handle the data? You need to explain what you're going to do with the data once you have it. So is your data in a computer? Is your data not in the computer? If your data is not in a computer, tell you what, it has to end up in a computer or you can't run any analysis on it. So you have to put all of your data in a computer. If it isn't already there, say your participants didn't complete an online survey or questionnaire, then you need to simply explain that you will put it into a computer. Then, depending on if you have to collect identifying information from your participants, you need to make sure we keep that data safe, and people that are reviewing your proposal need to see how. And so generally this kind of ends up sounding like boilerplate explanations that you're going to de-identify data, which means that you're going to just keep their data and take all the identifying information out of it. So if you got their name, you would take that out of it and you would just give them a random number. You collect their email address or compensation, you have to get that out of there and just give them a random number so that no one can tie their personal information to them if they were to get in front of this computer. You also need to explain how you'll keep it safe, right? And so essentially we just put it in a password protected computer. Some people might say they want to lock it. If you have paper data, they want to lock it in a safe with 3 locks, I don't know, who cares? You just need to come up with something relatively practical for how are you going to get that data in the computer? How are you going to take any personal information out of it, identifying information? And how are you going to keep it safe on a computer or off of a computer? The next thing is data cleaning. So what are you going to do with that data to help prep it for analysis? You might have some people in your study that started and never finished. You might have some people that literally just left your entire questionnaire blank. You might have some people that dropped out of the study and didn't want to do treatment anymore. And so you might not want those people's data, right? They're going to throw off your results. They're going to be outliers and mess things up. So what kind of things might you clean up about this data? Usually it's going to be people that didn't complete participation or something else that might be more particular to your design and your study. But you just simply want to say, we're going to delete them from analysis. And you'll see some examples in a minute. How will you analyze the data? So this is the statistical analysis. And you'll see here that I've given you one of 3 options. and I've started you out with how you should explain it, and then you can fill in with your variables afterwards. So everyone in there should have this line here. You can use it verbatim. You don't even have to paraphrase my line. How about that? Okay. All analysis will be completed using statistical package for the social sciences, SPSS version 24. Okay. So we have to say what we're using to do the analysis with. And this is the most common one that I use. There are some other ones, but for right now, you can just take that sentence and it can be yours, okay? Then you have to say what analysis you're going to do. And so that will depend on your research question. And so to answer my research question, I will one of these things. If you had a between subjects design that was comparing groups, so you had you were comparing races or genders, or you were comparing a treatment group and a control group or something like that, then you would want to use an analysis of variance, an ANOVA, comparing X and Y, or comparing whatever you're comparing. So you fill that in. And so if you had this design, this part of your analysis might say, to determine what the difference in postpartum depression risk is across white and Black women, I will employ a analysis of variance, ANOVA, comparing the postpartum depression rates across Black mothers and white mothers, okay? And so I chose the design that I had, and then I filled in the blanks with the specifics from my study. The second one is if you have a between subjects that's without groups. And so maybe you're not necessarily comparing two groups, but you're looking to see if certain variables help predict outcomes across people, right? And in that case, you would use an regression analysis to determine the amount of variance in whatever your dependent variable is. Let's use the postpartum depression example again. To determine the amount of variance in postpartum depression rate that can be accounted for by your independent variables. So in this example, race. Okay, and so if I were to plug in all of the specifics from that example, let's say to determine if the risk for postpartum depression is different across Black and white mothers, I will employ a regression analysis to determine the amount of variance in postpartum depression rates that can be accounted for by race. Okay, again, so I chose my design and I just plugged in the specifics. This last one is repeated subjects, so that's if you're doing a pre-post design, remember, and comparing the same people to themselves over time. So just like the other two examples, you will just plug in the specifics. So to determine the effects of, the ZYE diet, I will employ a repeated measures analysis of variance, ANOVA, comparing weight before and after the diet. Okay, just plugging it in. And so this, you don't have to paraphrase, okay? You can have my writing. We don't really make this really creative or different when we write in the social sciences because we're essentially saying very boilerplate things when it comes to the analysis. And so you can take this sentence and you can use the writing here and plug in your variables. That's fine. At the very end of this section, you're going to just briefly explain what you expect that analysis to show. And so after running that analysis, after comparing weight before and after the diet, I expect results to show that the diet was effective and weight was significantly lower after the diet than it was before. Or another example, after running the regression analysis with race as a predictor, results are expected to show that Black women are at a significantly higher risk for postpartum depression due to their significantly different attitudes about, mental health services or something, okay? And so that is essentially rephrasing your hypothesis a little bit more specifically, okay? So what are you going to do with the data? How are you going to store it, clean it, keep it confidential? How are you going to analyze it? Again, use the writing that I provided for you here and fill in the blanks. And then what do you expect that analysis to show afterwards? What do you expect the results to be? And so this section doesn't end up being very long. It's about a paragraph. Here's an example. Beginning of the example, we have how they're going to handle the data. And so to ensure all data remains confidential, researchers will enter the paper pencil questionnaire into a password protected computer. So we're getting the paper stuff in a computer. All the electronically collected data will be downloaded from the questionnaire software. They're not collecting any identifying information. They didn't need to, so they don't need to de-identify it. And then they talk about what data they might get rid of and clean. So all data for participants who didn't finish the questionnaire or didn't do the demographic survey will be deleted from analysis. The next part you have is the proposed analysis. So again, you see that they took the line there, which is good. All analysis will be completed using SPSS 24. And then they filled in the blanks here. To determine if, the research question, maternal age and employment status have a significant effect on higher stress levels in mothers, I will employ a regression analysis to determine the amount of variance in maternal stress levels that can be accounted for by occupational status and maternal age. Okay, so they plugged in their variables. Here are their expected results, and you can read through those. Here's another example, and so you can see that these look more similar to each other than the procedures or participant sections look, right? How are they going to handle data? So they're going to download the data from the questionnaire that they used online. They're going to get rid of data for people that weren't in their participant range, and they're going to get rid of the data for people that didn't finish participation and didn't finish the questionnaire. Proposed analysis, again, the same line about using SPSS. They plugged in their research question. This one also used a regression analysis, and they plugged in their independent variable and dependent variable. And then here are their expected results. So that's a pretty easy section to write. That's just something you need to cross off your list. The procedure section is easy to write too. It's just a little bit longer, and it requires you to think about how you might actually conduct this study in the real world and what you would have to do and what other people would have to do and what you would use. So those are the two things that you're going to put in your discussion board for this week. And this is our last discussion board, and the requirements are simple. You have to, just like previous weeks, post your draft by Sunday night. You're just going to post the drafts of those two sections, your procedure and analysis. Like I mentioned before, you do not have to post revisions of your participants and materials section. And then, like previous 2 weeks, your replies to your classmates are due on Monday. And so you want to make sure you look at any grade feedback you have for the previous, that you'll get tomorrow from your previous discussion boards, to make sure that you're meeting all the criteria and getting all the points for that, because the replies to your classmates are actually worth, you know, a pretty good chunk of points, as are these discussion boards as a whole. And so you want to make sure that, you know, you're meeting all those requirements. Remember, you need to point out something that they've done well, specifically, not saying that sounds great. Something that they've specifically done correctly according to the instructions, or you know, some other aspect of it that's very effective or high quality. Then you need to point out something specific that you can provide constructive criticism on, saying, but I think you could this, or pointing out a portion that could be improved upon. Then you need to say why and how, okay? So I think you could improve this, and then make a suggestion. Now, if you don't feel confident because you are not an expert on this yet to make a suggestion to them, that's okay. They don't have to use your suggestions, okay? Everyone's going to use my suggestions, and then if you want to use your classmate suggestions, you can. And if you make a suggestion to someone that I don't think is a great idea, I'll just make a brief comment about that, okay? The idea is try to make a good suggestion, and then we'll learn through that process as well. And so that's going to be it for this week, our last discussion board. And then next week, we're going to move on to formatting all of these bits and pieces into a paper.